Dr. Michael Mann, welcome back to the Climate Pod.
Thank you. It's great to be with you.
Well, your new book is The New Climate War, The Fight to Take Back Our Planet. What made you want to write this book?
Well, we've seen over the years, over the decades, in fact, this assault on climate action by fossil fuel interests and those doing their bidding, which in the past had been primarily aimed at discrediting the science, confusing the public and policymakers about the scientific evidence, discrediting the science, discrediting scientists like myself as a way of convincing the public that we don't have a problem. Well, what I've noticed over the past several years, what I began to notice, and it's become more and more obvious over time, is that these forces of inaction, I call them the inactivists, recognize that they can't deny that climate change is happening now. It's just become too obvious to the person on the street. We're seeing the impacts of climate change play out in real time on our television screens, in our newspaper headlines, in our social media feeds. And so they can't credibly argue that it's not happening or even that it's not caused by human activity. So what they've done instead is to pivot to this other sort of equally nefarious but more insidious set of tactics in their effort to thwart climate action, in their effort to keep us from transitioning off fossil fuels, keep us addicted to fossil fuels. As long as we do stay addicted to fossil fuels, the fossil fuel industry continues to make billions of dollars profits. And so they've turned to other tactics to try to prevent the needed transition. And I've been observing that, and it's been really troubling to watch it play out, to watch, in fact, allies, good faith, individuals and groups even be taken in by some of these insidious tactics. And so I felt like I sort of had to get it off my chest, but more than that, I had to sort of alert people to what I see as the primary obstacles that we now face, because we're so close. And we can feel it now, especially with this new administration coming in. There's a real opportunity for meaningful climate action here in the US and internationally. And we can't allow these obstacles that have been thrown in our way, these roadblocks that have been placed there by, again, the inactivists, to prevent us from moving forward. And so that's what this book is about, helping people understand how we're being played, how we're being fooled, how we're being encouraged to fight with each other. And that's one of the tactics, is to generate infighting within the climate advocacy community so that we don't present this united front demanding action.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of those hurdles that was placed in front of really solving the climate crisis was the inactivists in chief that we just had over the last 4 years here in America. Trump was absolutely horrible for the climate and for the environment. And you write in The New Climate War that was actually intentional. And that is a big reason why Russia wanted him to beat Hillary Clinton in 2016. So what was the fossil-fueled motivation behind Russia's interference in the 2016 American election?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I do think it's one of the more fascinating developments, and that it is critical to understanding everything that's happened. And it hasn't been covered that widely at all in the mainstream media. Rachel Maddow has talked about this quite a bit on her show and in her book that she's written on the matter. But other than that, it really hasn't gotten the attention it deserves, because it is critical to understanding, why did Russia want to hijack that election in the first place? And you have to look no further than, who ended up being Secretary of State, at least initially. That was Rex Tillerson, the CEO of ExxonMobil, the world's largest fossil fuel company. And indeed, ExxonMobil had a joint venture planned with Russia, with Rosneft, which is the Russian state oil company, to develop a $500 billion, $500 billion worth of fossil fuels that remain trapped in Siberia and in other areas controlled by Russia. Now, what was in their way were the sanctions against Russia for their actions in Ukraine, sanctions that had been put in place under the Obama administration, which Hillary Clinton would have kept in place. But in fact, Donald Trump, at his convention, at the Republican convention, with the help of Paul Manafort, who we now understand was literally working as a double agent, an agent for Russia, Ukraine, they changed the language in the Republican platform to get rid of the language condemning Russia for those actions and to eliminate their commitment to keeping those sanctions in place. And indeed, one of the first things that the Trump administration tried to do was get rid of those sanctions. They were unsuccessful because of some vestigial backbone on the part even of congressional Republicans who wouldn't go along with it. But nonetheless, that's critical to understanding what did Russia have to gain from this? Why were they trying to game our election? Why were they trying to interfere with our election online and in every other way possible? It was about $500 billion worth of fossil fuels. And so you have to look no further than fossil fuels to understand why bad actors like Russia, who see fossil fuels as their primary remaining asset. That's their largest asset. They want to monetize that asset. And they have interfered with politics around the world to actually prevent the sorts of action, climate action, that would obviously end our addiction to those very fossil fuels.
Well, during his presidency, Donald Trump did a lot to try to prop up the fossil fuel industry. But do you think that Donald Trump's presidency actually helped galvanize the climate movement over the last 4 years?
It's a great question. It's not my area of expertise. I'm not a political scientist, but I can sort of tell you what my impressions are. He was in many ways awful, obviously, not just for climate change, but the environment. And really, it isn't so much about Trump. It's about the polluting interests whom he delegated authority to when it comes to EPA, Department of Energy, when it comes to their environmental and energy policy. It was literally outsourced to the Koch brothers and the fossil fuel industry. It was sort of an unholy alliance. The Koch brothers, in fact, weren't big supporters of Donald Trump's initially. They didn't support him in the primary campaign, but there was this sort of this unholy alliance where they would continue, they would support Trump in his efforts, the things that he wanted to do, which mostly had to do, of course, with his backward sort of views about race and about nationalism, and they would let him do that. They would support his presidency as long as he appointed their hand-picked people to run the EPA and the Department of Energy, and essentially all of the administration departments that were relevant to energy and environment. And those industry lobbyists worked hard while the Trump clown show proceeded, and we were all distracted by it, understandably, given the terrible things and the threatening things that were happening, the unprecedented attack on our democracy. Nonetheless, it sort of took our attention away from what these folks were quietly doing, which was dismantling a half century, not just Barack Obama's environmental policies, but environmental policies that were put in place by the Nixon administration, reversing a half century of environmental policy. I think, as you allude to, that has galvanized the environmental community. A number of things, fortuitous perhaps, but important, have happened in the meantime. The youth climate movement, and maybe to an extent, even that was an outgrowth. It was a pushback against the sort of this renewed war on environmental sustainability by Trump and those promoting him. But you had the youth climate movement along with the pushback against Trump and this favorable shift in the political winds, sort of a new awareness in our politics about issues underlying racial justice with clear intersections with issues like climate justice. And just the fact that we don't have to use our imagination now to understand the devastating impacts of climate change. We're seeing it the wildfires out west, the hurricane season we had this year back east, devastating wildfires and heat waves and floods and droughts and superstorms that have really almost vivified, I guess, the threat of climate change for all of us. That's all come together, I think, to put us in a very favorable position, as bad as things might look, and as bad as 2020, was in so many respects. 2021, this year may be the year we look back on as the year where we made that pivot, where we finally did sort of take the actions that we need to do on a whole array of issues, perhaps, but certainly on climate.
And I hope so, for sure. And I think, after reading your book, I think it's really helpful to, if we are going to accomplish great things on climate, we need to be looking out for the strategies that these inactivists are deploying to do everything they can to delay action. One of those strategies is deflection. You talk a lot about deflection in your book. And how are inactivists using deflection?
Yeah, so this is a classic sort of industry disinformation campaign, deflection campaigns. And we've seen it before. I tell the tale in my book about, the beverage industry and how they used this iconic Crying Indian commercial that many of us grew up watching, which was a deflection campaign. We thought it was empowering us to act on pollution, but it was really an effort to distract us, to tell us, no, we don't need bottle bills. We don't need to regulate, industry and require them to process bottle and can litter, which would eat into their profits. Instead, the solution is just us picking up our bottles and cans. It's individuals. It's not regulation. It's not systemic action. And indeed, the Coca-Cola and the beverage industry was behind that public service announcement that was hatched on Madison Avenue as a classic example of a very successful deflection campaign. But look, you have the gun lobby, where you can summarize their deflection campaign in a motto: guns don't kill people, people kill people. That's a classic deflection campaign summarized in a single sort of motto that represents that organization. No, we don't need regulation. No, we don't need systemic solutions. We just need individuals to behave better. It's a classic way of taking the pressure off of, vested interests to engage in responsible institutional or corporate behavior, and instead put the onus on individuals. And as I, talk about at length in the book, the deflection campaigns of yore have clearly been appropriated now by the fossil fuel industry. BP, British Petroleum, was the one who gave us the individual carbon footprint calculator. They want us calculating our carbon footprints, not their carbon footprint. The fossil fuel industry has the overwhelming carbon footprint, but they'd rather have us focusing on our individual behaviors, our lifestyle choices, what we eat, whether we have children, what modes of transportation we use. And hey, even better if they can get us fighting with each other about our lifestyle choices, because then it once again divides the community, and we don't speak with a single commanding voice demanding change. So look, there are all these things, so many of them individual actions that we can take to sort of decrease our environmental footprint and our carbon footprint, things that make us healthier, they save us money, they make us feel good, they set a great example for other people. We should do all those things, of course, but we can't allow them to serve as, or for, again, the inactivists to somehow frame these as the only solution, as if, there is no need for systemic change, for policy solutions, because we won't get the dramatic reduction in carbon emissions that we need over the next several years without systemic solutions, without policies to incentivize that shift away from fossil fuels.
And you're seeing, climate, even people within the climate movement are people at least trying to fight for better climate solutions. You see people flight shaming and personal lifestyle shaming. And this is a strategy by the inactivists. And I just to kind of like put a finer point on that, like, why shouldn't people that are in the climate movement? Why shouldn't they call out other supporters for their personal lifestyle choices as it's related to their carbon footprint?
Yeah, so it's the problem is, and there's social science literature. I'm not a social scientist. I try to stay up on the literature. I have colleagues who are, and I try to learn from them. And one of the things that we've learned from the social science is that these sorts of efforts often backfire. They often lead to the opposite of the behavior. When somebody feels like they're being personally challenged and assaulted and condemned, um, there's a natural reaction to double down. It's like, no, I'm not wrong, and this is a problem here, because that sort of behavior, flight shaming people, or every bit as widespread, condemning people for their food choices, for eating meat. I don't eat meat. That's a personal choice, but I'm not out there telling other people what they should eat. I think that will backfire. And here's the thing: not only does it backfire often and not create the change that one might like to see, whereas more supportive messaging can support positive change, and a dual pronged approach where we encourage people to do things that save them money, they make you healthier, all this good stuff that'll happen if you do it. And it is helping out with this problem, but it's just part of the solution. We also need systemic. That sort of messaging, I think, is helpful. But when it comes down to finger pointing and behavior shaming and shouting at each other, again, there's the backfire effect that I talked about. And here's the other thing: it antagonizes the opposition, right? Again, let's compare and contrast. The gun lobby, they'll take away your guns. It's a very effective way of energizing their base. Look, these progressives are coming for your guns. They're going to take away your guns. They're going to take away your hamburgers. They're going to take away your opportunity to visit grandma during winter break. It's the same messaging. It's very effective. These people are trying to dictate your lifestyle, how you can live. That's a very effective way at energizing their base, sort of the disaffected right. And so I talk about that in the book as well. It is a great strategy for the inactivists, because it accomplishes so many of these tasks simultaneously. It checks so many of these cynical boxes when it comes to efforts to block meaningful action.
Sure. Well, the new climate war covers several bad solutions that are being funded right now as a way to combat global warming. I want to talk about one specifically: geoengineering. So, if you could first, just what's the theory behind geoengineering?
Well, the theory, it's based in science. There is credible science that demonstrates that, hey, look, if we wanted to prevent the planet from warming up, the most obvious solution is to stop carbon pollution, putting carbon pollution into the atmosphere, but never, underestimate scientists' abilities to dream up elaborate technocratic solutions to problems. And so geoengineering, the idea is that we do something else. What could possibly go wrong? We interfere, we engage in some other global intervention with this system that we don't understand perfectly, our climate system, with the only planet that we know in the universe that supports life. So there is no planet B. And we start toying in an uncontrolled and unprecedented way with this planet by doing other things like shooting sulfate particles into the stratosphere. We know that volcanoes release these particles into the stratosphere, and it can cool down the planet for several years before that stuff falls out of the atmosphere. It's reflective. It reflects some of the sunlight back to space. And so Mount Pinatubo in 1991, for example, dropped global temperatures by more than 0.5 degrees Celsius, better part of a degree Fahrenheit, for several years. And so if you do the calculation, we do have the technology. We could basically do the equivalent of a Mount Pinatubo every 3 years. And if we did that, that would be enough to offset potentially the warming effect of all of the CO2 we've produced. Here's the problem. The pattern of that cooling from volcanoes or from sulfate aerosols, human geoengineering sulfate aerosols, isn't going to look regionally like the pattern of global warming. They don't offset each other perfectly when you look at the spatial pattern, just in the global average. So global temperatures maybe would stop increasing, but you could actually cause some regions to cool down, other regions to warm even faster. You might melt the ice sheets even faster. You would probably cool down mostly the continents in the summer, which would decrease the amount of rainfall. So you'd get worse drought. And the list goes on. You would worsen ozone depletion because of the sulfur chemistry and acid rain. And there are all of these potential unintended consequences. I've just listed the ones that we understand and are pretty sure would happen. Who knows what else might happen if we tamper with the climate in this way? So finally, it's a means of sort of taking the pressure off of polluters and taking the pressure off the real solution here, the safest solution, which is to stop polluting the planet with carbon pollution. But it's very convenient to fossil fuel interests. You have technocrats like Bill Gates, who has a book coming out who sees climate change as an engineering problem. You know, when your only tool is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. When your only tool is technology, everything looks like a technical problem to be solved with technology. Again, what could possibly go wrong? But you've got people like Bill Gates, for example, funding, not just arguing for, but actually funding geoengineering research, and not just the research using climate models to tell us what might happen. That research is solid because we need to know what might happen, if for no other reason, to know why we don't want to do it. But when we start now talking about field campaigns, where we actually start to implement this stuff, that's taking us down a very slippery slope. I've focused on one geoengineering technique, but there are many of them, and really with just about all of them come sort of come these potential unintended consequences.
Sure, but they are getting a lot of funding, and we last year we spoke with the authors of the 2035 report, and they basically said, look, the United States could cut carbon emissions by almost 88% by 2035 using only the technologies that we have at our disposal today. I mean, we're talking about wind and solar. Those are tried and true technologies. So why do you think that these untested and potentially very dangerous options, like geoengineering, like that, putting iron fertilizer in the oceans, why are they getting so much attention and funding?
I don't think you have to look much farther than, again, the buck. It's about fossil fuel interests continuing to make massive profits. So they want to delay this as long as possible, and they want us to engage. Look, if they can no longer say we don't have a problem and we don't need to do anything about it. They have to look like they're trying to solve the problem. And so they put out these false solutions. They want to be able to claim that they support taking action. But when it comes down to it, they don't support the one action that can really make a difference, which is reducing our burning of fossil fuels, getting off fossil fuels, incentivizing renewable energy. So they want to throw up all of these other shiny objects, to distract us. Geoengineering is one of them. Carbon capture and sequestration, I talk about that at some length as well. Adaptation, they love to talk about we'll adapt, how if you live along the coast of, the Florida coast, or, low-lying Pacific Island that's being flooded now. How do you adapt? I guess by growing gills and fins. Maybe that's what they mean, because other than that, we will have to retreat from our coastlines due to massive sea level rise as we continue to melt the ice sheets. That'll displace, hundreds of millions of people. And where are they going to go? And so adaptation, look, we have to adapt to those changes that are inevitable, that are already baked in. And we can still keep climate change to a level where we and other living things can adapt. But if we let it go much beyond the warming that we've already seen and the impacts that that has caused, it'll be beyond our adaptive capacity or the adaptive capacity of our biosphere of other living things. And so adaptation, yeah, we have to adapt to those changes that are now baked in, but we have to prevent those changes that we still can. But nonetheless, technocrats, inactivists who want to look like they're about solving the problem, but in fact aren't, love to talk about adaptation and resilience. We just need to be more resilient, and innovation. They love sort of the discourse of innovation. Just let the market innovate. The market will solve this problem on its own. Well, no, it won't. We understand market economics well enough to know that if there isn't a price signal for the damage that fossil fuels are doing, then the market isn't going to respond. So we need that price signal. We need to level the playing field. And that can be through incentives, subsidies for renewable energy, like stimulus funding. And one reason for optimism is we did actually see Republicans join Democrats with that stimulus bill, support $35 billion of green stimulus. We need to be doing that. We need to be pricing carbon. So if you pollute our atmosphere with your carbon waste, you've got to pay for it. And if we use these sort of market tools along with, I call those demand side, we decrease demand for fossil fuels with those sorts of interventions, but there's also the supply side solution, not supporting new infrastructure for fossil fuels. And the good news there, just yesterday, Joe Biden announced, as many of us anticipated, that he would block the Keystone XL pipeline, which would deliver the dirtiest, most carbon intensive petroleum to the market if it were to build for decades, potentially, if it were to be built. And so it is important to stop that additional infrastructure because look, there's 5 times as much carbon now beneath the ground in proven reserves that fossil fuel companies know they can get at. There's 5 times as much of that as there is necessary to warm the planet beyond dangerous limits.
Wow. Well, I want to shift a little bit to people talking about, bad solutions, to just people talking about bad predictions about the future. And I just want to talk about what you call climate doomers, because it just seems like they are becoming more and more prominent. How have you seen doomerists try to steer the climate conversation over the last few years?
Yeah, it's pernicious, and I'll tell you what it is. A lot of these folks are well-meaning. They're on the right side of the issue. They're not climate change deniers. They're not allies of the fossil fuel industry. If anything, just the opposite. But what I argue is they've been weaponized. They don't realize it, but they're being played. And the sort of the flames of doomism are indeed being fanned by inactivists because they understand if they can lead people down that path of doom and despair and hopelessness, and take away agency, take away any agency, then it leads you to, potentially leads you to the very same destination as outright denial of climate change. It causes you to withdraw from the conversation, withdraw from efforts at actually combating climate change, mitigating climate change. They want you disengaged from they don't want you in the climate battle. And so they've, the inactivists, the forces of inaction have been very effective at sort of leading people down this, primrose path of doomism because they've already, sort of marshaled a large part of the conservative right for their cause of climate inaction, denialism, et cetera. If they can actually weaponize some on the political left, that's a huge win for them because they just want a majority of people to be disengaged. They don't care about the path you take to disengagement. They just care about the destination. That's where they want you to be. And so we have to realize that that doomism, that sort of doom mongering, despair mongering, some of it is undoubtedly authentic, but it's misguided. And There are false prophets here in this movement who've led people down this false path, and they do that by distorting the science in a manner that's just as egregious as the distortions by climate change deniers. For example, underlying just about every single one of the doomist narratives that you encounter today is this idea that runaway warming is now inevitable. It's no longer preventable. And it typically is based on the argument that somehow we will see so much methane, frozen methane from the Arctic released, that it will cause more warming than even all the burning of fossil fuels that we've engaged in. There isn't a shred of scientific evidence to support that. That is dead wrong. The science shows that there is sort of a modest, what we call positive feedback, where you warm up the Arctic, you do release some methane, so it increases the warming beyond what you would have gotten otherwise. And that's incorporated into climate model simulations. These so-called carbon cycle feedbacks are incorporated into the climate models. But what the climate models tell us is that the warming you get is pretty much a consequence of the cumulative emissions up to now. So if we stop burning carbon now, global surface temperatures plateau fairly quickly. And this is an important point because it's been long misunderstood. There is this continuing sort of misconception that the planet will continue to warm up for decades, even if we stop emitting carbon now. And that's based on sort of old-fashioned climate experiments, climate modeling experiments, where we treated CO2 as sort of a control knob, and you turn it up and the planet warms up, and the oceans continue to warm even after you stop turning it up because of what we call thermal inertia. The oceans continue sort of their sluggish warming response to the greenhouse gases already in the atmosphere. So that continues for decades. And we call that committed warming, and it's true. But that's combated by the fact that if we stop emitting carbon, then there are natural sinks of carbon, like the terrestrial biosphere and the oceans in particular, that will continue to draw carbon out of the atmosphere. So when we do more realistic experiments now, where we treat carbon as an input, a flux, we put it into the atmosphere, but we let the climate system itself sort out the sort of the destiny of that carbon, then some of it builds up in the atmosphere, but some of it is taken up by the biosphere and the oceans. And if we stop burning carbon now, the oceans and the biosphere continue to take up carbon for decades into the future. They actually draw CO2 levels down. That offsets the so-called committed warming. And so you've got that balancing that, and the sum of them is a flat line. So global surface temperatures actually stabilize very quickly. That's really important because what it means is that there is agency, that our actions now have direct and immediate consequences.
Yeah, and that's critical to understand because as more and more people become educated about what's going on with the climate crisis, they want to talk to other people about it. And you put it very succinctly in the book and very well, but what is the best way to communicate the climate problem to others?
Thanks. Well, yeah, it's sort of a tagline now. My motto these days is, urgency and agency. Yes, there's great urgency in acting now. We're already seeing devastating climate change impacts. If you're Puerto Rico, dangerous climate change, deadly climate change has arrived. If you're the West Coast states, California, Washington, Oregon, with those wildfires we see break out every summer now, dangerous climate change has arrived. If you're the Gulf Coast, with the hurricane seasons we're now seeing, dangerous climate change has arrived. If you're the Midwest, with that derecho storm that came through Iowa and wiped out their crops last spring, unprecedented storm that was fueled by climate change, warmth and humidity and energy in the atmosphere, dangerous climate change has arrived. And we could continue to talk about just about every region of the planet. So dangerous climate change has already arrived. It's not in our future, it's here. It's a matter of limiting it, preventing it from getting worse. And again, we have agency. We know that if we stop burning carbon now, the warming of our planet, that stops pretty quickly. So agency coupled with urgency. You need both. There's a real problem and it's urgent and we need actions to combat it now, but there are actions that are viable, and we can make a better future. And every, bit of carbon that we leave in the ground and don't burn makes our future better. So that's really, one of the messages I try to drive home. But the other message, it's one we've already sort of talked about here, is we are so close. We're so close to really seeing the action that we have so long hoped for and looked for. And we can't allow these insidious tactics that are being used, that these obstacles that are being thrown out there by fossil fuel interests and those promoting their agenda, the inactivists, as I call them. We can't allow that to get in the way of our efforts to act. And the first part, the first task in not allowing those efforts to succeed is understanding them, understanding where they're coming from, how they're being deployed, not falling victim to them, and helping make sure that others that are not falling victim to them. It's about getting information out there, but it's not just getting the science out there. Look, the science, it's not realistically even contested anymore, even by the naysayers. But there are these other insidious, again, these tactics that are being deployed somewhat successfully. Doom mongering, division, divisiveness, often related to getting us fighting about our individual lifestyle choices, which of course is a manifestation of this deflection campaign to get us to focus on individual actions rather than the needed policies. We just need to be aware of that. And the reason I wrote this book is that I felt that people needed to be alerted to these new obstacles. And most of them, it's not like I've discovered anything fundamentally new here. I feel like I'm just helping people understand what is happening, right in front of them, but somehow has been ignored or overlooked. That's really the message of this book. Understand how we're being played, because it's the only thing that's standing in our way now.
I think one group of people have really been able to effectively communicate what is going on with the climate and also like, push politicians to do something are young climate activists. You talk a lot about Greta Thunberg in the book and other young climate activists. Why do you think young people have been so effective at getting the attention of politicians and really pushing them to act?
Yeah, so I think the youth climate movement has been an incredibly significant development here, maybe even a game changer. I argue in the book. I was delighted that Greta Thunberg herself wrote a blurb for the book. She's sort of the effective leader of that international movement, but there are many, 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 really amazing young folks out there who are leading this effort forward. And what's so important, in my view, is that it's helped sort of shift the entire window of discourse about climate change. For too long, we've allowed it to sort of reside in this sort of technocratic space. It's about the science and the economics and policy and politics, when more than anything else, to me, it's about ethics. It's about for example, intergenerational ethics, our obligation not to leave behind a degraded or destroyed planet for my daughter, for our children and our grandchildren. This movement has helped recenter the conversation where it always should have been, about the fundamental ethical matters at hand, and the unethical nature of what we're allowing to happen to this planet right now. Look, these kids aren't in a position yet of authority and power. They've helped change the conversation, and that's critical. They've given us a foot in the door, but we now have to walk through. Those of us who are in a position to directly affect change have to take the opportunity that we've been given by Greta and other youth climate protesters and make sure that their efforts haven't been in vain. And so let's recognize that this is one important piece, one important strand in a number of strands that have come together now to put us at a very favorable sort of position, to put us in a very favorable position more favorable, I would argue, than anything we've seen yet, to actually affect the changes that are necessary, particularly with an incoming administration here in the United States, the Biden-Harris administration, that will lead on climate, that will restore science to its rightful role in informing policy, that will incorporate and already is incorporating climate action into every single department and agency within the government, and is once again announcing to the world community that we are back. And the United States now is ready to help lead this effort. All of that is coming together. It's an incredible opportunity, one we can't afford to squander. And that's why we can't allow the forces of inaction, the inactivists, to be successful with this new climate war, with these new insidious tactics that they're using to prevent us from finally making that transition.
What are you most looking forward to as far as climate goes, when it comes to the Biden-Harris administration?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's a difficult one because what they're sort of doing, which is different from what Obama and everybody who came before really did. We used to think of climate as sort of residing in a couple agencies, maybe the Department of Energy and the EPA, for example, and maybe a little bit in Commerce, NOAA, Interior, but really EPA and DOE, and that's where all the action, was seen as being, belonging, residing. The Biden administration sees it much more holistically. That, look, climate change impacts every facet of modern life, and we have to incorporate climate-friendly policies into every agency. The Treasury, even, right? We need to require companies to disclose climate risk when they seek federal funding. We need to incorporate climate into agricultural policies. We need incentives for carbon-friendly agricultural practices, Department of Interior, forest management, and so on. So they're sort of appointing people, cabinet-level positions across the board who have bona fides when it comes to the climate crisis and in incorporating the climate crisis into policy. So it's hard actually to point to any one thing because of the expansive approach that they're taking. The one thing is to take a leadership role. The United States once again has to lead the world. That's the most important thing we can do. Diplomacy and setting an example for the rest of the world.
Well, we just had another record-setting year in global temperatures, and I know climate scientists get tired of being asked about these types of records. But what did you make of 2020 finishing, tied or even just above the hottest year on record?
Yeah, look, the planet will continue to warm up as we continue to pollute the atmosphere with carbon pollution. So no surprises to scientists who study this. This is what we expect. We expect global surface temperatures to continue to increase as long as we're emitting carbon. And there's where there's a little bit of a disconnect in public understanding as well. It isn't enough to just stop the increase, to flatline carbon emissions, which we're sort of doing. And in fact, last year, they actually came down about 7%. Some of that was due to COVID. A lot of that was due to COVID-19 lockdown, social distancing, et cetera, less travel. But some of that was due to the decarbonization of our global economy, which is happening. So those carbon emissions are starting to come down. They flatlined. But until they come to net zero, until there's no net carbon being emitted into the atmosphere, and that's the difference between what we're putting into the atmosphere and what natural systems can actually pull out. A small amount of that, but a non-trivial amount. Until we bring those emissions down to net zero, the planet continues to warm up. The surface of the planet continues to warm up. So we've got to bring those carbon emissions down by a factor of 2 within the next 10 years and down to zero net emissions by 2050 to remain on a course where we keep the planet below 1.5 degrees Celsius, roughly 3 degrees Fahrenheit warming, which is where we start to see the worst impacts of climate change. So we got to bring those carbon emissions down dramatically. The planet will continue to warm up until we do that.
Well, you end the book on a very hopeful note, and I want to end this conversation on the same. So what are you most hopeful for? What brings you the most hope as you look forward to the next few years?
Well, it's the kids, to be honest. The youth climate movement has really given me a lot of optimism. Look, this generation gets it. They know we need to act, and we need to act right now. Problem is, they're not yet in positions of authority and power, so we have to do it for them. But they help provide me that energy. Look, the revolutions that we've seen over the last decade on marriage equality, and now, literally as we speak, I think we're going through a tipping point moment on issues of racial equality, and that signifies that we're ready to, we can see dramatic increases in public support and support for action on issues, the great crises that we face. When activists and advocates work hard to keep the issue at the forefront of our discourse. And it's happened on marriage equality, it's happening on issues of racial equality and racial justice. And I think we're ready to see that tipping point moment on climate. But we need, you don't get a tipping point unless you continue to push forward. So we need to use all of the tools in our toolbox to make sure we push forward, because we are so close to finally achieving the action that we have for so long wanted to see on the climate front.
And you've really been pushing for that action for so many years. Thank you for all of the work that you've done to really put the climate crisis and its solutions, at the forefront of public thought. The book is The New Climate War. I'm telling you, it is a fantastic book. If you haven't read it, go out and read it. Hand it to a friend who may be, who may not be as well informed on the issue, but also these strategies that inactivists are deploying, because it really does give you a guidebook of things to look out for. So, Dr. Michael Mann, thank you again for joining the Climate Pod.
Thank you. It was a real pleasure.